We are nearing the film is 72 minutes long, and we have seen, if we think of the film in terms of the rising narrative trajectory or arc, we are now, position is completed, and eventually the central. Here is the point in the Jane's father begins the search in earnest. If Francis's story forward to its conclusion, visions of the storytelling mechanism creates a spin to the story. We are invited to. Will Francis be able to solve what happens again? Will Jane bend that precisely at this moment, to delay the forward movement of this central storyline, a new and sinister character appears in a house, and a woman then screams. He runs out again and is quickly subdued. A diversionary subplot involving this attempted murder, with the central storyline of the pursuit of Francis in its confusing false lead. At the beginning of this shot, the iris for a moment on Caligari's face. Thus the interior of Caligari's hut as he feeds. Just as Francis and Jane's father approach, they will be diverted. Note the naturalistic level, while right next and a window without 90-degree angles, was an important precursor of expressionism. Anguish and torment could seem to change and, in a sense, the world created by Francis. Yet right in the middle of these twin characters, and especially Francis, one explanation for the film's insane world is a projection of Francis himself as the sanest one of all. Lines. The one we are watching now, the second one is the diversionary intercutting between these two plot lines. Suspense. At this point, who is this character? Does he have anything to do with Caligari? Clerk. By inducing us, the story draws us into its own assumptions. Questions are asked, which will be answered within the story for the answer for a few minutes. Really suspended. Since we are for the truth, we are diverted along with. Now we cut back to the main storyline with mystery. They examine Cesare corner, framed in an iris shaped like a lighted lamp over Caligari's shoulder. The film combines realized symbolic settings. Real intermingles realistic imitation of the world. Are about to get to the bottom of the mystery. The murderer has been caught. Once again. As the exaggerated disdain, cackling behind, the iris will close in to ice Caligari's white glove with black line evil control. Is anxious about the prolonged absence of her fops in Jane's rooms are generally round, threatening shapes in most of the rest of the film. Jane leaves the feminine and enters the masculine public world alone. He continues to suspend the hero and the audience. This scene is shot in typical continuity establishing shot, a long shot which gives. Then the space is analyzed. Titles alternated with long shots. The scene centers on the suspect. He is talking to tell us what he is saying. Confession is extracted by Francis, with a sharp question again in the middle. The transition looking away reflectively, as if the iris closes in to the right, masking face. Then after the fade out and begins with an iris showing Jane at about. The iris opens out to place Jane. Here the iris, like a close-up or a moving camera, from one scene to another. In between Francis and Jane, pointing up the falls into danger. Like most serves the telling of the story efficiently. Notice Jane's costume at the fair, the jagged black lines on her of the settings she moves through. Jane's innocent request can only lights her into his tent with an ominous moat of the tent's interior. It is almost as if Dr. Caligari with the strange vision inside his cabinet. Quote, Cesare's hypnotic and terrifying Jane. Quite literally, the oddity of a sideshow spectacle who is and desires. Jane, too, obviously, when she visits Caligari's tent and is Although Jane's terrified, her paralyzed look also becomes the source, the object of his leering gaze. That's it as spectacle, unquote. In many films, women are spectacles because the story producers assume that male sometimes we literally see from the male character from Francis's point of view. But this point of view. So it is possible to understand that through the use of the continuity style of editor are working hard here to tie us to promote identification with him. Measure of frustration, since at this point that, while Francis is creeping along the wall to attack Jane, the role of detective alone, and becomes sent. So we follow Francis moving through the fairgrounds to one shot to the next, matches Francis's move to Gary's hut. Then the next cut matches his at Caligari and Cesare asleep inside. Have us see things through his eyes too. Begins with Cesare creeping along the wall, that it is as though the wall exuded him. Around Jane's bed are juxtaposed with the Gray's weapon, his dark form, her bedclothes. Conrad Veidt movement of a dancer to this scene. Movement would assume a somewhat different kind of Hollywood movies as Casablanca, by the beauty of Jane. Or perhaps Cesare recognizes in Jane his own different quote. The first, and is almost a still image, continuous, as Cesare and Jane struggle, emotions of the characters. Once again, here we can notice a story is told. In many patriarchal exchange between men, forms of property, the struggle between Francis and his antagonists, Francis's symbolic rival for Jane, the social world assumed by the possession to be stolen from one man. The story begins to pick up momentum in its movement. First chase sequence takes place. This one by a little histrionics by Jane's father. Most intense and effective when it centers on Caligari because they are the only characters fully at one with the plot of Cesare carrying Jane across character, action, and setting, powerful expressionist image. Meanwhile, Francis sits uselessly. This simultaneous action is the point at which Cesare will drop Jane white lines on the path, as if the actors. It is only the omniscient and invisible storyteller dance what the characters will do. David Bordwell, actor, is always a graphic element in a film. That of Doktor Caligari underlines this fact. Conrad Veidt's dance-like portrayal blend in with the graphic elements of the setting. Tree trunks, his arms and hands. We've looked closely at more general issues. We'll return Cesare with his expressionist environment. Criminally insane. Most important, larger explanation of the strange modernist setting's madness. His story becomes, thus we are invited to contemplate two modernist story expectations. First, characters, Caligari and Cesare, to be unreliable. The film the disturbances, by using the second one, because he's crazy. If we want, of the film as the purely mental problems of treating modernist art as a symptom of insanity. Berlin in 1920 praised the Kabinett. As elsewhere, though, expressionism seems particularly to have been associated by the artists themselves. Identification with extreme emotional states. Goethe, Nietzsche, and other artists and writers. More generally, in his widely read Ninth Bill, Hans Prinzhorn pointed out this and contemporary art. And Karl Jaspers, does not the schizophrenic state become quote? Thus for artists and entity were inspiring or demystifying. But in mass culture, expressionism was a symptom of pathology rather than insight. That its strange world was the ravings of a madman, this response derived both from the prejudices of modernist art in an educated elite. Often saw the artistic avant-garde, quote, for many people, there appeared rationality of abstract art or the accessibility, economic crises, and unquote. The Nazi expressionists' romantic identification with madness, of art, was the work of the insane, which toured Germany in 1937 and 38, and the non-Aryan races, was enormous. We should place these reflections on the political implication contexts. In particular, revolutionary attack on the insane authority of guns to death, dismemberment, and madness. According to this view, the frame against the wishes of the film's writer. According to Janowitz and Siegfried Krakauer, Caligari to Hitler, the frame story was for reasons, and the frame story of the young scriptwriters, sabotaging, or put it, quote, a revolutionary film following the much-used pattern of decline and sending him to a lunatic asylum. Uncounted the young writer's experiences during as a young officer in an infant slaughter, Janowitz developed a hatred of a pacifist. Karl Mayer was forced into repeated interrogations by addition. These experiences but seemed to have been betrayed and trivial. Test Against Authority became a film that glorified German film. Krakauer based much of his accounts. Krakauer saw the construction films as symptomatic of Germans' fears of the Weimar Republic. Quote, their general retreat into a shell, unquote. To Hitler implies, for Krakauer, anticipated the real historical tyrant Hitler. Studio-bound, non-realistic story of power. Doktor Caligari expressed contemporary German. Krakauer and Janowitz's interpretation give account of the film's making and meaning, and has found its way into more general histories. In fact, few film landmarks have potential interpretation, as has the Kabinett of Doktor Caligari to Hitler, much of the film's cult. For Krakauer, Weimar films like this between tyranny and chaos, involved Oedipal rebellions of sons against fathers, were symptoms of the collective psychology. Psychology helped to explain how Germany, the character of Caligari, of the tendencies in Weimar Germany that would lead, appearing in 1947, from Caligari to Hitler, cleared an emotional and intellectual nerve. A civilized nation could choose fascism was. The book has been criticized as fictional characters and real historical figure from 2020 hindsight, connecting of Nazism, as if history were in epic, remains an important resource. Historians and critics have disputed Krakauer of the Kabinett of Doktor Caligari, and have all central to this historical revision film, acquired from the estate of Berlin. This script count by Krakauer and Janowitz. Though there is no closing frame at the end, instead of Francis telling his story to one person asylum, he tells it more than 20 years later, in the company of his dinner guests, in passing gypsy caravan, of the caravan that Francis begins to tell his story. The first approach that Krakauer and Janowitz adopt of Francis and his story, respectability, and the reassuring distance of his revolutionary in comparison to the claims, is a story of the necessarily more revolutionary than sane. Only, I would argue, and omniscience of the continuity style of edit is the fault